The mop moved in slow, careful arcs across the corridor floor. Back and forth. Back and forth. The kind of rhythm that belongs to a man who has done this 1,000 times. Except he hadn't. Adrian Cole was on his knees in the service corridor of the Meridian office tower. A building his family had financed. A building whose lobby tiles had been chosen from a catalog that arrived on his father's desk 12 years ago. And he was wringing gray water from a mop into a bucket that smelled of bleach and old rubber. His hands were wrong for the work. Not soft exactly, he kept himself fit, always had. But the skin across his knuckles was smooth in a way that said he had never done this before. The calluses were in the wrong places. His grip was wrong. His posture was wrong. He kept his head down anyway. Cole. The voice came from behind him, sharp and flat, the kind of voice that had decided somewhere along the way that small authority was still authority. Dennis Holt was a compact man in his late 40s, with a supervisor's badge clipped to a polo shirt that had been washed too many times. He had the walk of someone who had waited a long time for a little power and had no intention of wasting a single moment of it. Cole. I'm talking to you. Adrian looked up. His face was steady. Not submissive. Not defiant either. Just steady in a way that seemed to bother Dennis more than either of those things would have. This section was supposed to be done before 7, Dennis said. He gestured at the far end of the corridor with his clipboard. It's 7:14. You want to explain that to me? Adrian looked at the floor. The tiles were clean. Had been clean for the last 6 minutes. Won't happen again, he said. Dennis stared at him a beat too long. The way a man stares when he can't find a foothold on someone. And then he turned and walked away, clicking his pen against his clipboard. Adrian watched him go. Then he picked up the bucket, emptied it into the utility drain, and rinsed the mop head with the kind of focus that, if you had seen it out of context, you might have mistaken for peace. It wasn't peace. But it was something he was building toward. He had been here 6 weeks. Let me take you back. Because nothing about Adrian Cole's life started in a service corridor. His father, Gerald Cole, had built an empire the old way. Slowly, quietly, one brick at a time. Cole Holdings began as a single cement distribution company, the kind that nobody photographs and nobody writes articles about. Gerald worked it for 11 years before it turned a serious profit, and for those 11 years, he lived in the same 2-bedroom apartment with Adrian's mother, drove the same aging car, and told anyone who asked that patience was not a virtue, it was a strategy. By the time Adrian was 12, the company had expanded into construction, then into real estate, then into logistics and supply chains that stretched across the country like a quiet nervous system. Nobody outside of certain circles knew the Cole name. Gerald preferred it that way. He taught Adrian to ride a bicycle on a street in an ordinary neighborhood, even though they could have afforded a gated estate by then. He made Adrian take the bus to school until Adrian was 15, and he made him do it alone. Not to be cruel. Because he believed, with the absolute certainty of a man who had earned everything he had, that comfort unchallenged produces blindness. And then, when Adrian was 22, Gerald Cole had a stroke. He survived it. He would have 2 more in the following 7 years, each one taking a little more of the man with it. The last one, Adrian was 31. He sat beside his father's bed at the end. It was a private room in a private hospital, the kind of place that smelled of expensive flowers and very little hope. There was a lawyer outside the door who had already been there since the morning. There were cousins in the waiting area whose names Adrian knew but whose faces had only recently become frequent. There was a woman, his father's companion of the last 4 years, sitting near the window, crying in a way that was very carefully positioned to be visible. Gerald was still lucid that last afternoon. His body had conceded, but his mind was still in there, watching all of it through eyes that hadn't lost their precision. He looked at Adrian for a long time. Then he said, quietly and without sentiment, "Every woman who has ever held my hand knew what I was worth before she knew my name." Adrian didn't answer. What could he say? "I spent my life building something," Gerald said. "I'm not sure I built anything else." He died before morning. What followed was the machinery of inheritance. The reading of the will, the transfer of assets, the meetings with lawyers and accountants and board members, the letters from institutions that had suddenly discovered a deep and warm relationship with the Cole family. It was orderly and thorough and felt, to Adrian, like watching strangers catalog your childhood home and assign everything a price. He sat through all of it. He signed what needed signing. And then he closed the boardroom door behind him and stood in the corridor outside. A different corridor, marble-floored, hushed, expensive, and understood that he was now worth more money than he would ever be able to spend. He was also completely alone. Not in the way that means there are no people around you. In the way that means none of the people around you actually see you. They see the Cole name. They see the portfolio. They see the power that needs managing and the relationships that need maintaining. They see an asset in a suit. He drove home. He sat in his apartment. The good one, the one his father had quietly purchased for him 6 years ago in a building that bore no Cole name, and he thought about a woman called Priscilla. He had met Priscilla Addo 2 years before his father died. She was an event consultant, sharp, well-dressed, connected to the kind of social circuit that orbited wealthy families at a respectful distance, close enough to be useful, far enough to seem independent. She had a good laugh and strong opinions about art. She asked intelligent questions and remembered the answers. Adrian had believed, for 14 months, that she loved him. He should have noticed earlier. There were signs, the kind that are perfectly clear in retrospect and perfectly invisible in the middle of wanting something to be real. The way she asked about the Cole family structure with just a little too much curiosity. The way certain conversations about his father's health had a quality of attention that was subtly different from concern. The way she was, he realized later, extraordinarily patient in a situation where patience had a specific value. A man named Raymond Frost ran a logistics firm that had been quietly losing ground to Cole Holdings for 6 years. Raymond was not the kind of man who accepted losing gracefully. He was, however, the kind of man who knew how to play a long game. Priscilla had been introduced to Raymond Frost's network before she was introduced to Adrian. The introduction to Adrian was not an accident. Adrian found this out not through confrontation or confession, but through a single email he was never meant to see. An administrative mistake, a misdirected reply, the kind of small careless moment that unravels years. He read it twice. Then he forwarded it to his lawyer, ended the relationship in a single conversation that lasted less than 4 minutes, and never mentioned it to anyone again. What it left behind was not grief exactly. It was something worse, a permanent double vision. The ability to look at any warmth directed at him and see, running beneath it like a second script, the question of what it wanted. Whether the person in front of him was reacting to him, or to what he represented. He managed it. He was competent enough at managing things. He attended the events he was expected to attend, maintained the relationships that needed maintaining, and carried the double vision everywhere like a pair of glasses he couldn't take off. Until his father died, and the weight of everything his father had left him made the glasses impossible to ignore. He had an empire. He had no idea who in his life was there because of it and who was there despite it. He didn't know how to find out, not from inside. So he decided to step outside. Took him 3 weeks to arrange it properly. He transferred operational oversight to his 2 most trusted senior executives. Men his father had trained. Men whose loyalty had been tested and was not to anyone's financial advantage. He told them he was taking a leave of absence for personal reasons. He asked them not to make inquiries. They were professional enough to understand that some requests are not requests. He liquidated enough personal cash to live modestly for a year. He found a flat. Small, clean, on the 3rd floor of a building where nobody cared who lived above or below them. He had not lived somewhere like it since university, and even then, he had been known as the boy whose father could make certain phone calls. Here he was just a name on a tenancy agreement. The name he gave was real. He didn't invent a persona. He wasn't running from his life. He was trying to find a piece of it that was still unclaimed. The apartment was registered to Adrian Cole. But the bank account he used was a personal one, modest, with a balance that suggested a man of ordinary means. A man who needed work. He found the cleaning company through a poster on a notice board in a cafe 2 streets from the flat. It was a staffing agency that supplied commercial cleaning crews to office buildings across the city. The pay was standard. The hours were early morning. The interview was a 20-minute conversation with a woman behind a desk who seemed more interested in whether he'd pass a background check than in anything he had to say about himself. He passed the background check. He was assigned to the Meridian office tower. The irony of it did not escape him. He stood in the lobby on his first morning, white polo shirt, dark trousers, a lanyard with his photo on it, and looked up at the atrium his father had commissioned. The tiles he remembered from the catalog. The light fittings that had been a point of debate in a board meeting he'd sat through at 25. He picked up a mop and started at the north end of the service corridor. 3 days in, Dennis Holt had decided he didn't like him. Adrian couldn't determine why with any certainty. It might have been the steadiness. It might have been that Adrian never deferred enough. Not disrespectfully, just not enough. Dennis was the kind of man who needed to feel the hierarchy landing on someone before he felt comfortable, and Adrian's calm was like a surface that didn't absorb the impact properly. So Dennis pressed. Small corrections delivered in a large voice. Public reminders about protocols that everyone else was also breaking. The clipboard pointed. The name repeated. Adrian took it. Not because he had to. Because he was choosing to. He was here to learn something, and losing his patience with a petty supervisor was not the lesson. He was 5 weeks in when he met Claire Hensley. She was working the floors above him. The Meridian Tower ran 2 cleaning teams, one for the lower commercial floors, one for the upper office suites. Claire was on the upper team. He might have gone the entire placement without crossing paths with her if it hadn't been for the supply room. The agency ran a single supply inventory for both teams, stored in a room off the loading bay. There was one key, signed out on a rotation that the schedule was supposed to manage, except the schedule was a laminated sheet that hadn't been updated in 4 months. The result was that people arrived for supplies at the same time with some frequency and had to negotiate. Adrian arrived at 5:30 on a Tuesday morning to find the room already open, the key already in the door, and a woman he didn't recognize crouched beside the lower shelves counting rolls of paper towel with an expression of focused displeasure. She was somewhere in her early 30s, with the kind of practical efficiency in her movements that suggested she did not spend much time on things that didn't need to be done. Her lanyard said Hensley, C. She was wearing the same polo shirt he was wearing, and her hair was pulled back with the single-mindedness of someone who had resolved that particular decision in the morning and was done with it. She didn't look up when he came in. "Requisition number?" she said. He paused. "I don't have one." The schedule said. "The schedule hasn't been right since March." She stood, holding the paper towels. "We log requisitions now. That's how we stop both teams running out on the same day." "Nobody told me that." "I'm telling you now." She turned, saw him properly for the first time, and gave him a brief, calibrating look. The kind that isn't unkind but isn't especially warm either. "You're on the coal team?" "The lower floors." Coal team was what the cleaners called the crew serving the coal holdings' contracted floors. The irony had become something he took a quiet, private pleasure in. "Yes," he said. "There's a form on the door. You fill it in before you take anything. Takes 30 seconds. She moved to pass him. "I'll need mop heads," he said. "We're out." She stopped, looked at him again. Then she set the paper towels down, went back to the shelf, checked a logbook he hadn't noticed, and handed him 3 mop heads. "Sign the form," she said. "Date, quantity, what you took. You keep the logbook?" "Someone has to." She picked up the paper towels again. "The mop heads are supposed to last a week per head if you wring them properly. You'll get through them faster if the bucket's too full." He looked at her. She had already turned toward the door. "Half full," she said over her shoulder. "Not to the top. You get more control and the head doesn't pick up as much old water." She left. He stood there for a moment in the supply room, holding 3 mop heads, mildly stunned. It was the most genuinely useful piece of advice anyone had given him in 6 weeks. He filled in the form. He signed it. He wrote the date and the quantity, and he thought about the mop heads all the way back to the service corridor, and he thought about her. He ran into her again 4 days later in the same supply room. This time they arrived at the same moment and both reached for the logbook simultaneously. Their hands didn't quite touch. They each took a step back. She handed him the logbook. "You first," she said. He filled in his entry, passed it back. She wrote hers with the same focused efficiency she seemed to bring to everything. He noticed she crossed her sevens. "You were right about the mop heads," he said. She glanced at him. "Half-full bucket. I noticed a difference." She looked at him for a moment, and he had the sense that she was genuinely trying to work out if he was making conversation or reporting a result. She seemed to decide it was the latter, which apparently was worth responding to. "It matters more on the older linoleum," she said. "The tile on your floors is dense enough that it doesn't make much difference to the finish, but the mop head lasts longer either way." "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. She closed the logbook, set it back precisely where it had been. 3 years with the agency," she said. "Before that, hospital laundry. Before that, other things." She said it in the way a person states a fact that is neither a complaint nor an apology, just a sequence of events that led to a present moment. "What made you move from hospital laundry?" She looked at him with a slight tilt of her head. Not suspicious. More like she was deciding whether the question deserved an honest answer or a closed one. "The hours were worse and the pay was the same," she said. "Here, at least, the building's empty when we're in it. There's something to be said for working before the world shows up." He understood that more than she knew. "I know what you mean," he said. She didn't respond to that. She picked up her supplies. "The floor wax for Suite Fortwelve is running low," she said, as if they had been in the middle of a purely logistical conversation all along. "I already submitted a request. Should be restocked by Thursday." "Noted," he said. She left. He found himself standing in the supply room smiling, and he wasn't entirely sure when he'd started. Over the next 2 weeks they kept finding each other in the orbit of the supply room, the loading bay, the brief corridor between the two zones where schedules occasionally overlapped. They argued on a Wednesday about the correct technique for cleaning the glass panels beside the main elevator bank. Adrian had been using the standard issue spray and the blue microfiber cloths. Claire stopped, watched him work for 30 seconds with the expression of someone watching a person eat soup with a fork, and informed him that the smearing he was seeing on the glass was because he was spraying directly onto the surface and letting it sit too long before wiping. "Spray the cloth," she said. "Not the glass. One pass, top to bottom. No circles." "There's a smear right there," he said, pointing. "Because you went in circles. I've been doing it this way for 2 weeks. And the glass has been smeared for 2 weeks." She wasn't unkind about it. She simply stated it as observable fact. "Nobody cleaned it properly before you. They'll notice eventually." "Who'll notice?" She glanced at the elevator panel. "Whoever owns this building." He had to look away for a moment. She handed him the cloth, properly dampened. He did it her way. The smear disappeared. "There," she said, the way a person says there when the thing that was always going to be true is finally visible. "You've done this your whole life?" he said. "Cleaning." He hadn't meant it the way it could be taken, as diminishment. She heard the genuine curiosity in it, or decided to. She considered the question properly. "I've done a lot of things," she said. "My mother was a nurse and my father was, I don't know what he was exactly. He moved around. He had skills he never turned into anything permanent." She was looking at the glass, at her own faint reflection in it. "I used to think I'd study. Interior design, actually. I had a whole plan. What happened to it? Life happened to it." She said it without self-pity, which somehow made it heavier. "My mother got sick when I was 22, and then sick got worse. I was working before I'd had time to figure out what work I wanted. By the time there was space to figure it out, I'd stopped asking the question." She blinked, and the reflective moment was over. She was practical Claire Hensley again, holding a cleaning cloth. "We should do the other panel." They did the other panel. He thought about her for 3 days after that. Not the fact of her, the shape of her, how she moved through a room, but the texture of what she'd said. The way she'd described giving up on something she'd wanted without drama, without bitterness, as simply a thing that had happened in the sequence of things that had happened. As if her own life was a building she'd been assigned to maintain rather than one she'd been permitted to design. He wanted to know more. He wanted to be careful about it. Not for any strategic reason. He was done with strategy in human connection. He was careful because she was the kind of person who would notice if the interest was performance, and she would close like a door. He was careful because it mattered. For the first time in a very long time, something mattered that had nothing to do with what he owned. They started eating their breaks in the same place by accident, and then kept doing it by unspoken agreement. There was a bench in the loading bay, partially sheltered from the wind by a corrugated overhang. Not attractive, but it was outside, and in the hour before dawn, the city made a particular sound, a low, rumbling stillness, that both of them had independently decided they preferred to the noise of the staff room. She brought tea in a flask. He brought coffee. She noted, the first time she saw the coffee, that he used a decent thermos. "Good thermos," she said. "Thank you. I've had mine 5 years. What brand?" She told him. He made a note of it, not on paper, but in the careful inventory he was keeping of all her details. They talked about small things at first. The building, the schedule, the particular tyranny of the supply room logbook. Then they graduated slowly to larger things. She told him about her mother, who had died 4 years ago, leaving Claire a flat she was still paying off and a standard of care she was still trying to live up to. She talked about her mother the way people talk about their clearest point of reference, not with unending grief, but with a precision that said this person had mattered enough to shape the way I see everything else. He listened in a way that was new to him, not the performed listening of board meetings or social occasions, where the listening is a transaction. You give me your words, I'll demonstrate that I receive them, we both move forward. This was something else. He was genuinely interested in what she would say next. He leaned toward it. He told her things too, carefully but truthfully. He told her his father had died recently, that they'd been close in a way that was complicated to explain. Built on respect more than warmth, though the warmth had been there too, just underneath the surface where they both seemed to prefer it. He told her his father had taught him that patience was a strategy, that he'd spent most of his adult life being strategic about things and was finding it a difficult habit to shed. She listened to this with the same focused attention she gave everything. "What made you start this?" she said one morning, meaning the job. "You don't seem like someone who needed to." He was quiet for a moment. "I needed to know what I was like when nobody was watching," he said. She looked at him. The loading bay was quiet around them. Somewhere inside the building, an elevator moved. "And?" she said. "I'm still finding out." She wrapped both hands around her flask. "That's an honest answer," she said. Most people would have said something less true. He almost told her everything right then. He could feel it, the specific pressure of a truth that has been held too long and recognizes the right container. He opened his mouth, and then his phone buzzed in his pocket. His other phone. The one that was the real Adrian Cole's phone. The one he kept on silent for emergencies. The one his senior executive used when something couldn't wait. He stood. "I have to go," she said. She was already looking away, back toward the building. Not hurt. She had a gift for not performing things she didn't feel. He walked far enough that she wouldn't hear. The call was routine. A countersignature needed on a land transfer, nothing that required him personally, but a reminder that the world he'd stepped out of was still there, still turning, still making its demands. He handled it in 4 minutes. When he came back, she was already inside. He sat on the bench alone. The city was starting its morning noise, the first buses, the first distant engines. The sky above the loading bay was beginning to go from black to the dark, exhausted blue that comes just before the real light. He sat in it and thought about the distance between who he was and what she thought he was, and how, every day that he didn't tell her, the distance grew longer and crossing it grew harder. He was going to have to tell her, but not yet. Not until he was sure she saw him. The actual him, not the Cole name, not the portfolio, not the accumulated weight of everything he'd inherited. He needed one person to know him first, before they knew what he was worth. He needed that so badly he was willing to risk exactly the thing he feared. He just hadn't understood yet that the risk had already been sitting beside him for 6 weeks, drinking tea from a 5-year-old flask, and paying far closer attention than he realized. 3 months in. That was how Adrian measured it now. Not in board meetings missed or quarterly reports unread. His executives handled those with the quiet competence of people who had been given a gift and knew better than to waste it. He measured time in mornings, in loading bay benches, in the particular quality of Claire Hensley's attention when she was listening to something she found genuinely worth hearing. They had graduated, without announcement or ceremony, to something that neither of them had named but both of them felt. He brought coffee. She brought tea. They arrived separately and left separately, and between those 2 points, an hour passed that both of them seemed to need more than sleep. He had learnt things about her that he suspected she had never organized into a single portrait, because she was not the kind of person who stood back and looked at herself. She was the kind of person who moved forward. She had a younger brother she supported quietly, not dramatically, not in a way she ever talked about unprompted, but it surfaced in the texture of her budgeting, the way she talked about overtime with something more than casual interest. She had opinions about architecture that were specific and confident and rooted in an eye that had clearly been trained somewhere, even if the training had never been formalized. She was funny in the driest possible way. A single flat sentence delivered with perfect timing, and then she'd look at something else, as if the joke had nothing to do with her. He was, for the first time in years, happy in the uncomplicated sense of the word. Not satisfied, not comfortable, happy. The distinction mattered to him, and he was living inside a lie. He managed it with the same competence with which he managed everything, careful, compartmentalized, tightly controlled. The other phone stayed off during work hours. Board calls happened in his car, in the car park of a supermarket 20 minutes from the tower. The flat was clean and ordinary and contained nothing that would declare him. When he thought about what would happen when the truth came out, and he knew it would, he was not delusional about that. He told himself he would choose the moment. He would tell her himself on his terms, before she found out any other way. He told himself this with great conviction. He told himself this right up until Dennis Holt started paying attention to Claire. He noticed it first in the schedule. Cleaning supervisors at the Meridian Tower had a degree of flexibility over team assignments that was technically administrative and practically personal. Dennis had been exercising this flexibility for longer than anyone wanted to examine. Over the previous 2 years, Adrian would learn this later, in full, he had repeatedly reassigned female agency cleaners to solo tasks in low-traffic areas of the building. Late evening runs in the parking structure. Early inventory work in the supply wing. Jobs that removed a person from visibility and placed them in proximity to Dennis Holt. Most of the women had quietly requested reassignment through the agency. A few had left altogether. None had made a formal complaint, because Dennis's contract, the Meridian Tower account, was the agency's single most lucrative client relationship. There was a particular gravity to money in institutional settings. It does not declare itself. It simply bends things toward it, slowly and without announcement, until what should be upright is angled in its direction, and nobody can clearly remember when the tilt began. Claire had been resistant to him from the start. In the wordless, practical way, she was resistant to anything that didn't make sense. She did not engage with his particular brand of attention. She did not respond to the way he positioned himself in doorways when she was leaving rooms, or the way he found reasons to discuss her schedule in conversations that didn't require discussion. She documented everything she was asked to do. She kept copies of her requisition forms. She had the instincts of a person who had learned early that the only reliable protection against the abuse of small authority is the meticulous creation of a record. She told Adrian none of this directly, but he was paying attention. He had spent the last few months learning the specific grammar of how Claire communicated, what was said and what was pointedly not said. And he began to notice the spaces around Dennis Holt. The way she shifted when Dennis entered a room she was in. The way her responses shortened. The way she was, he realized with a slow and cold clarity, managing him carefully without confrontation, the way you manage a thing you've correctly identified as unpredictable. He wanted to ask. He checked himself. He understood that asking before she was ready to tell him would not be concern. It would be pressure. And Claire Hensley did not respond well to pressure applied from any direction. So he watched and waited. The shift came on a Thursday in the 7th week of what he had started calling, privately, the problem of Dennis Holt. Adrian was returning cleaning equipment to the storage room off the service corridor when he heard the voices. Dennis's first, not raised exactly but with an edge that had weight, the edge of a man who has said the same thing multiple times and is allowing his patience to become a weapon. And then Claire's, even and controlled, saying, "That's not in my assignment sheet, Dennis." "It is now. I've updated it." "I'd need to see the updated sheet." A pause. The kind of pause that is not a pause but a pressure. "Are you really going to make this difficult?" Dennis said. "I'm asking to see the updated assignment," Claire said. "That's not difficult. That's procedure." Adrian stood outside the door. He did not move. He was running a very rapid and precise calculation that involved the question of what was most useful here, his presence or his absence. He opened the door. Both of them turned. Dennis's expression moved quickly from one thing to another. Adrian caught the first one before it became the second. It was the look of a man interrupted in a private arrangement. "Cole," Dennis said, "this doesn't involve you." "I came for the buffer pads," Adrian said. He crossed to the shelf, located the buffer pads, took them off the shelf with complete calm. He looked at Claire. "Are you on the south corridor this morning?" She looked at him. Something in her eyes registered what he'd done. The question was a cover, and she heard it as one, and she accepted it without a word about it. "Yes," she said. "I'll walk that way," he said. Dennis said nothing. What could he say? Nothing had happened by any definition that could be written down. Nothing had been said that was undeniable. This was how these things worked, by staying in the space between what could be proven and what was real. They left together. In the corridor, Claire walked beside him at the same pace she always walked, equipment in hand, face forward. After 20 seconds, she said, quietly, "Thank you." "I didn't do much," he said. "You did enough," she said. They walked the rest of the corridor in silence, and it was the kind of silence that has something in it. Not comfortable, but weighty in a way that mattered, the silence of two people who have just admitted to each other, without a single word about it, that something is wrong and that they are, between them, going to deal with it. That evening he called his head of legal affairs from the supermarket car park. He did it carefully. He did not use the Cole Holdings Company name. He asked, in the way a man asks when he already knows the answer but needs confirmation, about the supply chain of the cleaning contract at the Meridian Tower. Who held the contract? Who the supervisory structure was? Whether there had been any reported incidents or agency complaints that had been absorbed into administrative decisions rather than formal process. His legal director was thorough and did not ask unnecessary questions. What she told him, 2 days later in a document sent to his personal email, made him sit for a very long time at the small kitchen table in his modest flat. Dennis Holt had supervised cleaning operations at the Meridian Tower for 6 years. In that time, for female agency cleaners had requested transfers through the agency's internal process, citing what the agency's HR log described, in language careful enough to be nearly meaningless, as interpersonal scheduling conflicts. One had submitted a formal complaint to the agency's management. The complaint had been reviewed, discussed, and filed without outcome, at a meeting that had been attended by the agency's account manager, whose primary account was the Meridian Tower contract, and whose performance review was partially benchmarked against the retention of that contract. The contract was with Cole Holdings. Cole Holdings had never been informed. The agency had managed it downward, the way organizations manage things that are expensive to surface and cheap to bury. Adrian read the document twice. Then he folded his hands on the table and sat with the specific weight of knowing that the wealth he'd walked away from had, in a corridor he had been physically present in, protected the man who was targeting the woman he loved. He had not used that word to himself before. He sat with that too. He made 3 decisions that evening. The first was that Dennis Holt's employment situation was going to change. Not immediately, not in a way that could be traced back to him before he was ready, but with certainty. He began setting the conditions for it through channels that would take another 2 weeks to arrange. He was patient. He was, as his father had taught him, strategic. The second was that he needed to tell Claire the truth. Not to preempt discovery, though that was becoming urgent, but because he had run out of reasons that felt more important than honesty. He had found what he came for. He knew what he was like when nobody was watching. He was, it turned out, a man who crossed a room without being asked and found buffer pads he didn't need and walked someone to a corridor because presence was the only protection available to him in that moment. He was a man who sat at a small table reading a document about institutional failure and felt it as a personal wound. He thought, someone she deserved to know fully. The third decision was less a decision and more an acknowledgement of something he had been resisting since the loading bay bench, since the glass panels, since the supply room and the mop heads and the crossed sevens in the logbook. He acknowledged that he was completely, irreversibly, impossibly in love with Claire Hensley, who had told him her tea flask was 5 years old with the same tone another person might reserve for something they were proud of, and who had given him one honest look over a correctly dampened cloth and changed the quality of every morning he'd had since. He was going to tell her everything. He just needed 2 more weeks. He did not get 2 more weeks. It was a Friday morning, 11 days after the supply room corridor, and Adrian was running late. There had been a call. Unavoidable, a contract renewal with a timing clause that could not be delegated at the final stage, and he'd handled it from the car, which had made him 20 minutes later to the building than his schedule required. He signed in, changed into his work clothes, and went directly to the service corridor. Claire was not at the usual loading bay bench. He noted it and moved on. She had her own schedule. She was on the upper floors this morning. He put it aside. An hour into the shift, he heard a door. Not the door. There were dozens of doors in that building, they opened and closed continuously. But this one was followed by footsteps that were faster than the usual pace, and when he looked toward the service stairwell, he saw Claire coming through it with an expression he had not seen on her face before. He had seen her controlled. He had seen her brisk. He had seen her dry and funny and quietly sad and focused in the way a laser is focused. He had never seen her shaken. She stopped when she saw him. Her jaw tightened, and in real time he watched her pull control back over herself with an effort that cost her. "Claire," he said. He said it quietly. He did not move toward her. He waited. She came to him, stopped 3 feet away. She was holding her requisition folder against her chest, both arms wrapped around it, and her breathing was not quite right. "He put his hand on me," she said. She said it flat and quick, the way you say something when you need to get it out before anger overtakes the words. "I was doing the panels by the Suite 4 lift and he came in and I told him I was recording my hours and he said some things, and then he put his hand on my arm. And I moved and she stopped, pressed her lips together. He grabbed my wrist. He said he could fix my schedule. He said it was up to him whether the agency renewed my contract." The service corridor was very quiet. Adrian stood in it and felt something shift in him. Not a dramatic rupture, not heat or rage or the operatic collapse of composure. Something more fundamental than that. A decision made at a level below language, the kind that doesn't require deliberation because the answer is simply obvious and has been obvious for some time. He looked at Claire. "Where is he now?" he said. He went toward the executive floor. "Adrian." She said his name with a particular emphasis. A tone that said she knew something was happening and she couldn't quantify it. "Don't. I'm not going to hurt him," he said. She looked at him. She was still reading him. She was always reading him. "Something is wrong with you," she said, not unkindly, in the way a person says something is wrong with you when they mean they cannot get the measure of it. "You're not a cleaner. I don't know what you are, but you are not a cleaner. And right now you're looking at me like a man who can fix things, and I need to know what's about to happen." He held her gaze. The 2 weeks he'd needed were gone. The corridor was not the moment he would have chosen. She was not in the state in which he would have chosen to tell her. None of the conditions were right, and all of them were irrelevant. "I'll tell you everything," he said. "I promise you. Right now I need you to stay here and I need to go and end something." She stared at him. "Adrian." "I'm coming back," he said. "I'm coming back and I'm going to tell you everything and you're going to be angry with me and that's completely fair. But right now," he pulled the other phone from his pocket, the one she had never seen, the one that did not belong to the man she knew. He watched her eyes go to it and then back to him. He walked toward the executive floor. Dennis Holt was in the management office on the 32nd floor, a room that was technically a Cole Holdings meeting room, loaned as workspace to the agency's on-site supervisors as part of the service contract. He was sitting behind a desk that was not his, in a chair that was not his, in a building that was not his, arranging papers with the satisfied air of a man who has convinced himself that proximity to a thing is the same as owning it. He looked up when Adrian came in. He started to say something about operational zones and the fact that the lower floors team had no business on 32. Adrian said, "Call your agency director." Dennis blinked. "I'm sorry." "Call your agency director," Adrian said again. He was standing in the center of the room and his voice was entirely level. "Tell her there is a meeting required today. Tell her it concerns the Meridian Tower contract. Tell her to bring whatever documentation she has on file regarding internal complaints made by agency staff at this site in the last 3 years. Dennis set his papers down slowly. Something in his expression was changing. Not yet understanding, but feeling the edges of something it couldn't name. "Who do you think you're talking to?" he said. Adrian put the phone on the desk. On the screen was an email thread. The thread was brief and unambiguous. It was addressed to the agency director, from Adrian's legal director, and it cited the Cole Holdings account number in the subject line. It confirmed a review of the service contract. It requested the complaint documentation. Dennis read it. He read it twice. His eyes moved from the phone to Adrian's face. He started. "Call her," Adrian said. The agency director, a woman named Sandra Voss, arrived at the Meridian Tower inside 90 minutes. She came with a file. The file contained 4 transfer requests and 1 formal complaint that had never been formally resolved. Adrian sat across from her at the conference table and read each document in full, and Dennis Holt sat at the end of the table and said very little because there was very little left to say. "The contract," Sandra began. "The contract will be reviewed," Adrian said. "The terms under which it has been administered will be reviewed in full." He looked at her directly. "What should concern you more urgently is that 4 women and a formal complaint were managed by your organization in a way that protected a supervisor over the people he was supposed to be responsible for. That is the conversation we need to have." Sandra opened her mouth, closed it. She was recalibrating quickly. She was a competent woman in a very uncomfortable situation and she was doing the arithmetic in real time. "Mr. Cole," she said carefully, "I want to be clear that the agency takes these matters. Dennis Holt is suspended from this site effective this morning," Adrian said. "You'll formalize that through your own process. But he will not return to this building today or any day pending the outcome of that process. If that's not something your organization is prepared to do by close of business, the contract conversation becomes a different kind of conversation." Dennis stood up. "You can't just," he said. Adrian looked at him. That was all. He just looked at him. With the specific, unambiguous calm of a man who has spent 32 years in rooms where power is exercised and knows exactly what it feels like to hold it without performing it. Dennis sat back down. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. When it was over, Adrian walked out of the conference room and took the service stairwell back down to the corridor. He was not running, but he was not slow. Claire was where he'd left her. She was sitting on a crate in the service corridor, her requisition folder on her knees, her tea flask open in her hands. She had the look of a person who has decided that the way to wait for something uncertain is to find the smallest possible stillness and hold it. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. He stopped in front of her. She searched his face. She was very good at reading people. Not intuitively but carefully the way she did everything. She had been reading him from the first day in the supply room, and she had known for a while that the picture was incomplete. Now she saw something she hadn't seen before. The full picture. "You own this building," she said. It wasn't a question. "My family company financed it," he said. "We hold the operating lease." "Yes." She looked at him for a long time. "The cleaning contract," she said, "is ours." "Yes." "So Dennis worked for you." "In a structure I hadn't examined closely enough." The weight of that landed in his voice despite himself. "I'm sorry for that, Claire. I don't have a version of the last 3 years in which that's acceptable." She was quiet. She looked down at the tea flask. Then she looked back up at him, and her expression was not what he had braced for. It was not rage, not betrayal expressed as heat. It was something quieter and more precise. The expression of someone who has been told a thing that retroactively rearranges a great deal of what they thought they understood. and is working through the rearrangement in real time without assistance. "Your name," she said. "Adrian Cole." "Yes." "The Cole team." The ghost of something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but related to one, and not happy. "I called you that for 3 months." "I know. Did you think that was funny?" "No." He paused. "Not funny. Complicated." She stood up. She put the flask away. She clipped the requisition folder under her arm with the efficiency of someone who needs to do something with their hands while they think. "I need to go," she said. "Claire." "I'm not running," she said, and there was a precise distinction in her voice between running and needing to not be here right now that she expected him to hear. He heard it. "I need to think. Without you in front of me." He nodded. She walked toward the stairwell. At the door she stopped, hand on the frame, without turning. "Dennis," she said. "Is it done?" "He won't be back in this building," Adrian said. She was still for a moment. "Good," she said. Then she pushed the door open and was gone, and her footsteps moved up the stairwell, and then there was nothing, and Adrian stood in the service corridor of a building his father had financed and looked at the tiles his father had chosen from a catalog and understood, with the full force of clarity that comes too late to be comfortable, that the disguise he had worn to find something real had become the thing standing between him and it. He had told himself he was hiding his wealth. He had actually been hiding himself. And now the person who had managed, in 6 months of mornings and supply rooms and perfectly dampened cloths, to see past every other barrier he'd ever built, that person was standing on a staircase above him, deciding whether the man she had seen was real or just another version of the performance. He didn't know what she would decide. He knew, for the first time in a very long time, that the outcome was not his to engineer. He could not buy it. He could not manage it. He could not arrange it through the right channels with the right people and the right documentation. He would have to wait. He would have to be patient. Not as a strategy. As the only honest thing left. She didn't come to the loading bay bench the next morning. He was there at the usual time. Flask of coffee. The city making its low rumbling sound below the overhang. The sky going from black to the exhausted blue that preceded dawn. He sat in it for the full hour and she didn't come, and he poured half the coffee onto the concrete and went inside to do his work. He had no right to be surprised. He was not surprised. He was simply present with the absence the way you are present with a thing you knew was coming and still weren't ready for. He cleaned the lower floors with the same care he had given them every morning for 3 months. This mattered to him, that the work did not change because the circumstances had. He wrung the mop at half-full bucket the way she'd taught him. He sprayed the cloth, not the glass. 1 pass, top to bottom, no circles. The elevator panels were clean by 6:45. Dennis Holt's clipboard was gone from the hook in the supervisor's room. Someone had already cleared his logbook from the desk. The room was simply an empty room now. Adrian worked until his shift ended. He signed out. He changed back into his civilian clothes in the locker room, the good coat that he now understood he should have left at home months ago because it was one of the things Claire had seen and filed away, one of the small inconsistencies that had told her story before he had. He put it on anyway. It was cold outside. He drove to the flat. He made coffee he didn't drink. He sat by the window and watched the street. He did not call her. He did not have her number. They had existed entirely within the building, within shifts and supply rooms and loading bay benches, and he realized now that this was its own kind of symbol. Their whole connection had lived inside the disguise. He didn't know if what grew inside it could survive outside. He went back the next morning. And the morning after that. Not to be present in a way that pressured her. He went because the work was his work, and walking away from it to manage his own discomfort would have been exactly the kind of maneuver the old Adrian made. Solving the feeling by repositioning himself, by choosing the exit over the exposure. He stayed. He mopped. He sprayed the cloth. On the 4th morning she was at the bench. He came through the loading bay door and she was sitting there in the pre-dawn cold with her flask in both hands and her breath making small clouds in the air, looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who has spent several days having a conversation with themselves and has reached, if not a conclusion, at least a resting point. He sat down at his usual distance. He did not speak first. He had long since learned that there was a kind of speaking that was just noise designed to fill a silence you were afraid of, and Claire deserved better than that. She looked at the street beyond the overhang. A delivery lorry was making its slow negotiation around the corner. The city was still mostly dark. She said, "I've been thinking about the glass panels." He waited. "You practiced," she said. "After I showed you. You went back and did it again until you had it right. I watched you the next morning. You didn't know I was watching." He said nothing. "That's not something a man does," she said. "When he's performing. That's something a man does when he actually cares about doing it right." She turned and looked at him. Her face was not soft. Claire Hensley's face was never soft. It was precise and honest, and it gave you exactly what it had. No performance either way. What it had right now was complicated. "I'm angry," she said. "I know. I'm angry that you sat across from me at this bench for 3 months and knew things about me that I couldn't check against what I knew about you. Every conversation was uneven. You had the full picture. I had a chapter." "You're right," he said. "That's the most honest description of what I did, and it doesn't have a version where it was acceptable." She looked at him steadily. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" He thought about the practiced answers. The ones about fear and Priscilla and his father's words and the architecture of distrust that 6 years of being Adrian Cole had built in him. He thought about all the ways to explain it that were true but still, in some light, convenient. He didn't use any of them. "Because I was afraid," he said. Plainly, "I was afraid that if you knew what I was worth you'd stop seeing what I was. And you were the first person in years who seemed to see it. I held on to that too long because I needed it too much. That was selfish. I dressed it up as caution. It was selfish." The delivery lorry had gone. The street was quiet again. Claire held her flask. "I'm not interested in your money," she said, and the way she said it was not an assertion of virtue. It was simply a fact stated with the same flatness she brought to everything factual. "That's not what this is about." "I know. What this is about," she said, "is that I let someone in. I don't do that easily. You know that about me by now." A pause. "And the someone I let in was only partially real. The part you let in was the most real part one have," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I believe that," she said. "That's the thing that makes it complicated. If I didn't believe it, this would be straightforward. I'd just walk away." "I know. So I'm left trying to work out," she said, "whether the thing between us is real or whether it only felt real because it was contained in a situation that wasn't. Whether any of this survives contact with your actual life." She looked at him directly. She was asking a question she actually wanted answered, not a rhetorical one. "I don't know," he said. "I don't have a guarantee. I can't construct one. I know that if it doesn't survive contact with my actual life, that's a failure on my part, not a limitation of what we built. What we built is the most genuine thing I've put my hands to in longer than I can account for." She looked at him. He looked back. The loading bay was cold and unglamorous and smelled of rubber and early morning, and he was sitting in his good coat on a bench outside a building he technically owned, asking a woman with a 5-year-old tea flask and crossed sevens in a logbook to decide whether he was worth the trouble. No title. No portfolio. No structure of authority or accumulated wealth to stand behind. Just this. He had wanted to know what he was like when nobody was watching. He was, it turned out, a man who could sit very still in the cold and wait for someone to make up their mind. Claire looked at the street for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm going to need you to be honest. Going forward. Completely. If I ask you something, I need the full answer. Not the answer that manages the situation." "Yes," he said. "And I'm going to need time. This doesn't just reset. You can't buy that back, and I don't think you'd try. But you can't rush it either." "I understand." She looked at her flask. "And you owe me at least 6 months of decent coffee on this bench," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but the place a smile comes from. "My thermos is better than yours," he said. "Your thermos is ostentatious," she said. "It keeps coffee warm for 12 hours. That's showing off. It's practical. It's excessive. Mine is practical." He said nothing. The sky was beginning to lighten at its edges, the dark blue breaking open into something almost gray. In an hour, the building would fill with people who wore good suits and had important meetings and would walk across the tiles his father had chosen without knowing what was under their feet. But right now it was just this bench. Just this overhang. Just two people in work clothes drinking from thermoses in the cold, and something between them that had survived, by the narrowest and most undeserved margin, the weight of everything that had been withheld. "I have to start my shift," she said. "Yes." She stood. She clipped the flask into her bag with her usual efficiency. She looked at him once more, and what was in her face was not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness was something that would come slowly in the correct sequence because she was not the kind of person who skipped steps. What was in her face was something earlier than forgiveness and more fundamental. Willingness. She was willing. That was the beginning. She went inside. He sat on the bench for another minute in the early light, and he thought about his father. Not the empire, not the words at the end, but the earlier version, the man who had put a bicycle on an ordinary street and made his son learn balance the hard way, and who had believed with absolute conviction that comfort unchallenged produces blindness. What he hadn't told his son, or perhaps hadn't known, was that the same was true of armor. Armor unchallenged produces its own blindness. The blindness of a man who can no longer feel whether the protection is working, because he can no longer feel anything at all. Adrian had felt everything in the last 6 months. He picked up his coffee and went inside to finish his work. In the weeks that followed, things were resolved in the order they deserved to be. Sandra Voss and her agency conducted a full internal review. It was not voluntary in spirit, but it was thorough in execution, because it had become the cheaper option. The 4 women who had transferred out received formal letters, acknowledgments of what had happened, of the way it had been handled, of the gap between procedure and outcome. One of them had left the industry entirely. The letter could not undo that. Adrian's legal director ensured that the financial settlement offered to each woman reflected what the original concealment had cost them. Dennis Holt did not return to the Meridian Tower. He did not return to supervising cleaning staff at any site under Cole Holdings contracts. The language used in the process that removed him was precise and permanent. There was no dramatic public moment. There rarely is with these things. The mechanism that had protected him was simply withdrawn, and without the mechanism, what he had always actually been was visible to anyone who needed to look. Adrian restructured the service contract. Not punitively, the lower-level staff, the people who did the work, kept their positions. What changed was the oversight architecture. Complaints would now route directly to a Cole Holdings compliance contact, bypassing the agency's internal account management entirely. It was a structural fix for a structural failure, and he knew it was not enough, because structural fixes never fully account for the human willingness to find new paths around them. But it was the honest work, and he did it. The agency brought in a new supervisor for the Meridian Tower. Her name was Margaret. She was 61 years old, had been running teams for 20 years, and had the calm authority of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove to anyone in any room. The staff liked her within a week. And separately, quietly, with no announcement and no occasion made of it, Adrian Cole resigned from the cleaning agency's roles. Not because the work was beneath him. He was finished with that particular blindness forever. But because the experiment had given him what it set out to find, and staying would have been its own kind of performance. He had not come here to be a cleaner. He had come to be seen as nothing so that what was seen was true. He took 2 weeks. He went back to the boardroom. He sat in the chair his father had occupied and looked at the room his father had filled and understood, for the first time without grief getting in the way, that the inheritance was not the company. The inheritance was the lesson, the one his father had given him at the end, not as a gift but as a warning, out of a life spent being chosen for the wrong reasons. His father had wanted Adrian to have what he'd never managed to build alongside the empire. He had just expressed it, as he expressed everything, in the language of caution rather than the language of love. Adrian went back to work. The real work, the company, the contracts, the meetings. He was good at it. He had always been good at it. He moved through the boardroom without the double vision now, or at least with less of it. He knew the difference, finally, between a room where the warmth was real and a room where it was transactional, because he had spent 6 months sitting on a bench in the cold with someone whose warmth had no angle to it. He kept that knowledge like a compass. He went to the loading bay bench on Thursday mornings. Not every Thursday. Claire had her shifts, he had his schedule, and neither of them was interested in making the bench into something it wasn't. But some Thursday mornings, in the hour before the city fully woke, they sat under the corrugated overhang with their respective thermoses and talked about things that mattered and things that didn't, and the ratio of each varied by week and by mood, and there was no performance in any of it. She told him about the interior design course she had found. Evening classes twice a week at a college on the other side of the city. She told him the way a person tells you something they are still deciding whether to want, carefully with the exits kept available. He said, "You should do it." She said, "It's expensive." He said nothing. He was learning to let certain silences exist without filling them. She was not asking him to solve it. She was telling him something real about her life, and what she needed from him in that moment was to hear it. She enrolled the following month. Her own money, her own decision. He did not offer and she did not ask, and both of them understood that this was right. Not because pride required it, but because some things, to be fully yours, have to be reached for with your own hands. He drove past the college once, a Tuesday evening accidentally. Saw the lights in the windows. Thought about her in there with pencils and scale drawings and the particular focused pleasure that comes from finally doing a thing you should have been permitted to do a decade ago. He didn't stop. He drove home. He was patient. Not as a strategy. As a practice, the kind that requires daily effort and is never fully complete, and whose value is precisely that it can't be faked. There is something a man tells himself when he builds a wall around his life. He says, "This is protection." He says, "I have learned from experience and this is what experience teaches, and wisdom looks like distance, and distance looks like control." He arranges his life until the wall is invisible from the inside, until he can no longer see that he's inside it at all. Until what feels like freedom is just a very large, very well-appointed cage. Full of meetings and decisions and people who need things from him, and nothing that actually touches him. Adrian Cole built that wall. He built it from real materials. Real betrayal. Real loss. A father's dying warning that landed in him like a splinter too deep to reach. He had good reasons for every brick. Good reasons are still bricks. And a man who hides himself to be loved is still in hiding. The disguise he wears to find real love is itself the thing that makes real love impossible, because you cannot be truly known while concealed, and you cannot be truly loved by someone who is loving a version of you that you have curated for safety. Adrian learned this the hard way, which is the only reliable way to learn it. He learned it in a supply room with a logbook and a woman who crossed her sevens. He learned it in a loading bay at 5 in the morning. He learned it at the precise moment a corridor went quiet and he chose to cross it without being asked. He learned it when the mask came off not on his terms and not in the conditions he had arranged, but messily in a service corridor, in front of the only person whose opinion of him had ever felt entirely free of what he was worth. What she had seen before she knew the truth. That was the truth. The man who was patient with the work. The man who went back and practiced the glass panels. The man who stood in a doorway when the situation required standing in a doorway without calculation, without a plan. That man existed. He had just spent 32 years burying him under an empire. The empire is still there. It was always going to be there. You do not dismantle a life to find a real one. You learn to carry both without letting one erase the other. The wealth did not disappear and the responsibility did not disappear and the rooms full of people who needed things from him did not disappear. What changed was the man who walked into them. He walked in without the double vision now. Not always, it surfaced sometimes, the old reflex, the old reading of the room for angles and advantages. But he knew what it was when it came. He could set it down beside him on the bench and let it sit there while he had a real conversation. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. Before we close, I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it before you answer it, even to yourself. Imagine someone you trusted completely, someone who showed up consistently over months, who listened in the way that rare people listen, not to respond, but to actually receive what you were giving them, who crossed rooms for you without being asked, who told you true things about themselves, even the uncomfortable ones, even the ones that cost them something. And then you found out they had kept one very large thing hidden. not to deceive you for gain, not to manipulate you toward an outcome, but because they were afraid, because the last time they let themselves be fully seen, they were used for what they carried rather than loved for who they were. They were afraid of you knowing what they had, because they needed, just once, for someone to want them without knowing. Would you forgive them? And here is the harder question, the one underneath that one. Is a lie still a lie when the truth it hid was fear? I don't have the answer for you. I don't think there is one answer. I think the answer lives in the specific weight of the specific love in question, and only you can put that on the scale. But I believe, and I believe this about Adrian Cole, and I believe it about every version of him that has ever existed in any life, that the moment a person stops hiding and stands in front of you with nothing, no title, no armor, no managed version of themselves, asking to be seen rather than assessed, that moment is real. Whatever came before it. That moment is the beginning of something honest. And honest beginnings are rarer than we admit. They deserve a chance.